talking about going down and not up, you're in the eye of the storm here. I've got a bit of a problem here. You see, I've been under quite a bit of pressure from Richo. See, he's worried about the fact that the backside might fall out of the real estate market, and he's very concerned about the value of his little workers' cottage at Dover Heights. I suppose he's been reading too many shonky reports which suggest that residential property prices could plummet. Don't you like the word could? 30% from current highs, from a report earlier this month. Should social distancing restrictions on the housing market remain in place for a prolonged period? Now, that's a very good point, I might add. On the other hand, to date, Sydney property prices have defied the COVID-19 doomsday predictions. In other words, the alarmists were at work on property prices as well as on the number of deaths. But there are some factors here that need to be addressed. The first is a need to get back to normal business. Nonetheless, the government have announced significant stimulus packages, which has limited the damage. But then the closure of Australian borders will eliminate overseas migration, and that'll reduce the underlying demand for housing. On the other hand, if there is a second wave of new coronavirus cases through winter, which would cause an inevitable rise in unemployment and further restrictions to be put in place, property prices could fall significantly, especially in what are described as overvalued markets, and they're the larger markets of Sydney and Melbourne. Smaller markets like Brisbane, we're told, would fare a lot better. What is frightening in all of this, though, is when you look at some of the figures. Median Sydney house prices surpassed $1 million in February, and that was only 2.7% behind the 2017 peak. The median price in Melbourne was $819,000. The median price in Brisbane, not much below that. So what are we to make of all of this? Well, joining us from Sydney is Dan White, the Managing Director of Ray White Real Estate. Dan, before you get cross-examined by Richo, who most probably wants you to sell the Dover Heights Workers' Cottage before the end of the program, where are we right now on residential property prices, and how much has this social distancing and lockdown affected the housing market?
Well, good evening, guys. Yeah, it's certainly been a fascinating 6 or 7 weeks. The market is far more active than what most people would think. There is less listings in the market, but we're doing about half the volumes we were this time last year. So there is plenty of activity going on. There are a lot of our average buyers per property at the moment the same as it was 12 months ago. So there is a lot happening that gives us confidence in the resilience of the housing market. And a lot of reports, as you say, there are a lot of factors moving around the place at the moment. But the important thing is buyers are active in the market. They've got an opinion that now is a time still to invest in Australian real estate, and they're doing that.
Graham.
Well, all I can say is I don't want to ask about the price of my home here. I'm not about to sell. But is it worth trying to sell? I mean, I find it really hard to believe that when you've got society disrupted to this degree, massive disruption, that the housing market just continues on.
I can understand the concerns. I think that's the perception. That's why we've seen the half the number of properties come to market as what we'd normally see. So in the supply and demand that moves the market, there's a lot less supply in the market. There's probably half the amount of listings that we'd normally see. On the other hand, we have buyers there that are getting buyers in the market now that have never had cheaper interest rates and never will get cheaper interest rates. They're seeing the government stimulus come in. And as you know, investing in real estate is for the long term. So whether it's a V or U or an L or whatever the recovery is, they're looking further than that. They're saying, well, I need to buy in this market. My family's growing up or getting smaller, whatever it might be. They're realising that the property market is largely driven by interest rates, and they're active in the market. So the less listings in the market is fueling a liquidity that's working.
Dan, what's the relationship, just for lay people like us, what is the relationship between unemployment and the housing market? I mean, how important is it in the housing market for these restrictions to be lifted?
Absolutely. I think that's obviously all those forecasts you talk about, and obviously we've read them, all assume a certain level of unemployment, and they were all produced at a time when the curve was very steep and that sort of thing. So obviously we're all looking closely at what happens to unemployment and what sector of that market is. Is it unemployment in sectors which would be buying property is affecting those young families looking to enter the market? That's probably the key determinant that no one really understands or knows in the market. And that's why some people are taking the risk out of the equation. Some people are coming to the market now saying, well, there are active buyers in the market, there's less competition, let's go now and take the risk out of the market. Some buyers are saying, well, prices, maybe some volatile prices down the track, but I can still get set at low rates. So there's no doubt that obviously the unemployment spike back in the last recession, which is a long time ago now, obviously had a major play in the market. But remember then, interest rates were a lot higher than they are now. So there's a whole range of factors that are at play here.
Yeah. But see, Dan, what about the fact that the Australian borders, we're told, now are going to be closed for some time? Is that going to reduce the underlying demand?
Well, I think the population growth is always, as you point out, it's been a big factor in the growth of Sydney and a lot of our markets, and therefore the property markets. There's no question, as you point out, and especially for the new housing and projects for overseas buyers. So there's no question that is a risk to the market here, and that's something that obviously we're watching. But there, as I was sort of saying, the different elements here at play, whether it be rates, stimulus, unemployment, where it is. And you mentioned before too, Alan, that housing prices, you mentioned before 2017 was the last peak, and that's the case. And I think a lot of our markets have come off a couple of tough years, and there was inbuilt momentum in sort of January, February and early March. So when people compare prices, they often pick the two or 3 weeks where it was really at the peak, and they say, oh, well, it's fallen 10 or 15% off there. Yeah. I think if you go back over a year or two longer, we'll see a much more smoother market, even if some of those important parts of the market are taken away for us for a particular period of time.
Just on, what does it mean when I read...
Cranky
Sorry, Graham.
I was just going to say, if the Chinese get cranky with us and they try and turn off the student tap, so to speak, does that have a big effect on our unit market?
Yeah, no question that the overseas investment in the unit market in Australia is important. Obviously, it drives a big part of our market in the construction industry as well. So that is obviously a concern for us, what could happen there. Obviously, bigger factors at play that obviously I'm aware of, but it is a factor that no doubt the government will be taking into account, that the importance of Chinese investment through students or investment in off-the-plan projects will be an important factor that I hope they keep in mind as they work.
Dan, just before we go, Richo's in a prestige area. I mean, he's asking about overseas interests because he wants basically the whole world to be demanding for the Dover Heights Workers' Cottage. What's he going to look like? Is he going to make a big quid when he eventually puts it on the market?
Well, I think I know the gentleman that sold him the house, and he says that Richo is a great negotiator and bought very well. So I think he'll do well any time he goes. No, I think generally that market, I mean, eastern parts of the Australian economy or the property markets, we know the resilience they have. And we've heard economists talk down the Australian housing market for decades. And there are obviously new risks here or new threats that we're all coming to grips with. But there are obviously, for every risk, there's obviously another element that is giving us some confidence that there'll be more activity. And the key thing, I suppose, is the message that we're trying to present to the community is there is a lot happening. There's a lot going on in the market. It might give a lot of homeowners confidence in the value of their most important asset, that there is stuff going on. And while there are headlines and these people coming out with massive price corrections, if you look at what's happening today and seeing what activity is going on with the buyers and the fact that the banking system is very, very supportive of the housing market, those key drivers, I think, will underpin a lot of volatility.
Yeah, we've got to go. Moral of the story, Dan, is for the young people out there watching, you're not going to do any better than bricks and mortar. You're not going to do any better than bricks and mortar. So there we are. That was Dan White, who is the Managing Director of Ray White Real Estate.